Illidan's I-beam is powerful enough to melt even a Naru, but the I-beam that players get in game can feel surprisingly underwhelming if you don't invest in the talents and stats that support it. On its own, the damage is fairly modest, but that raises an interesting question. What happens if you fully commit to it? What if you build entirely around I-beam, stacking every talent and stat that amplifies it as much as possible? Let's start with the stats. Since I-beam deals chaos damage, the primary stat you want to focus on is Mastery, as it directly increases your chaos damage and therefore scales I-beam much more effectively than the alternatives. Mastery also comes with the added benefit of increasing your movement speed, which makes it an especially good fit for players who prefer a faster, more aggressive playstyle, or the type of the player who dives head first and get killed. By contrast, haste is not something I prioritize very heavily in this setup, because it simply doesn't have nearly as much impact on I-beam itself as Mastery does. On top of that, the Fell-Scarred hero talent, Enduring Torment, already gives you a passive 5% haste increase at all times. Plus, an I-beam focused build also tends to maintain Metamorphosis for a very long time, and during that window, you already gain a passive 20% haste increase. Then on top of that, the Furious Gaze talent grants an additional 8% haste for 8 seconds whenever you fully channel I-beam. Since I-beam's cooldown is usually kept below 20 seconds, this means that in actual combat, you are spending most of your time with a large amount of haste already active, even without investing much of it through gear. In my case, you can actually see my haste jump from roughly 5% to 36% by selecting Fell-Scarred hero talent and using Metamorphosis and I-beam. Wait, how is this any different from Self-Bloodlust? By going all in on Mastery, you can obviously run into diminishing returns at some point, so after reaching a certain amount of Mastery, it makes sense to start shifting some of that stat budget into Critical Strike instead. Because of the diminishing returns threshold, rather than mindlessly stacking Mastery forever, it's better to adjust your gearing and start picking up some crit alongside it. What makes the shift even more valuable is Know Your Enemy, which increases your critical strike damage by an amount equal to 80% of your critical strike chance. That means if you're sitting at 21% critical, you're effectively gaining 16.8 additional critical strike damage, which gives a crit a lot more value than it might seem at first glance. Next, let's look at the talents that actually strengthen I-beam. Shouldn't it be OP even without the extra setup? It's our core identity, but the reality is a bit less dramatic. If you don't invest into the talents that support it, I-beam simply doesn't hit hard enough to kill anyone. First, the hero talent choice here is Fell-Scarred, because Aldrich River is much more focused on enhancing Blade Dance and Throw Glaive, which makes it far less relevant for an I-beam center setup. Fell-Scarred, by contrast, directly supports the entire concept of the build. Through Monster Rising, it increases your agility even outside of demon form, which passively improves your baseline damage before you even begin your burst. On top of that, Student of Suffering grants an additional 18% mastery when you cast I-beam, which is especially valuable since I-beam scales directly with chaos damage bonuses, and perhaps most importantly, Demonic Intensity further empowers I-beam during metamorphosis, turning it into a much more threatening version of itself. To put that into perspective, if a normal I-beam deals 45,000 chaos damage over 2.2 seconds, the Metamorphosis version deals 54,000 chaos damage over 1.9 seconds, which means I-beam is effectively being strengthened by roughly 20% during your primary burst form. You sacrifice everything and turn yourself to a demon for a 20% damage increase. Next are the core Demon Hunter talents. Since I-beam deals chaos damage, you will want to pick up Internal Struggle to further increase your mastery, which directly scales the damage profile we care about most. After that, things get a little more ambiguous with Furious and Remorseless. Furious increases the damage of abilities that generate fury, while Remorseless increases the damage of abilities that spend fury. Under normal circumstances, I-beam looks like a spender because it costs 30 fury, but once you take Blind Fury talent, I-beam also begins generating fury while channeling, which makes the interaction a bit unclear. Since it's not entirely obvious which category I-beam ends up, I simply take both. And finally, to make sure the channel ends with real impact, Final Breath is absolutely worth taking since it amplifies I-beam's final tick by up to 300%, giving the end of a channel a much heavier punch than most players expect. Next are the Havoc talents. First, as mentioned earlier, Blind Fury is essential, increasing I-beam's duration by 20% and its damage by another 20%. For an I-beam focused build, this is one of the most important talents you can take. On top of that, Isolated Prey further strengthens I-beam by 30% against a single target. If the Demon Hunter pops I-beam against you, don't soak it alone. Share it with your team. Cycle of Hatred is also worth taking since it helps reduce Ivy's cooldown and allows you to bring your core ability back online more often throughout the fight. There is Chaotic Disposition, which is one of those talents that sounds much more confusing than it really is. The tooltip says chaos damage has a 7.77% chance to be increased by 17%, occurring up to 7 total times. I have no idea what this means, so let's ask ChatGPT. What the fuck? Let's just say I-Beam's damage goes up by an average of 9.25%. Next up is Collective Anguish, which you can think of as a straightforward way to push I-Beam even further. And finally, there is the Apex talent. The tooltip simply says that your next I-Beam is empowered and its damage is increased by 100% after using the hunt. This time, instead of stopping there, I am following the hunt with Metamorphosis and then casting the empowered version of I-Beam, Abyssal Gaze. At that point, you're no longer getting just the Apex bonus, you're stacking the 100% increase from Apex on top of the Metamorphosis enhanced version of I-Beam as well. The difference becomes very clear when you compare this setup to one with none of the I-Beam enhancing talents at all. To show that more clearly, I deliberately removed every talent that directly strengthens I-Beam, and I even swapped the hero talent over to Aldrash River. After that, I checked the damage again. The result was only around 21,000. By contrast, when you fully commit your relevant talent to amplifying I-Beam, that same spell jumps all the way up to roughly 160,000 damage. In other words, by building around it properly, I-Beam can be pushed to nearly 8 times its enhanced damage. Wait a minute, you still can't one-shot the enemy with I-Beam. This build is especially fun in PvP because the hunt makes finishing kills feel incredibly satisfying. There is something uniquely rewarding about chasing down a fleeing target, instantly closing the gap and ending the fight. It performs extremely well in chaotic battleground fights because it still has a strong AoE pressure, but thanks to talents like Isolated Prey, it also remains very threatening against a single target. That combination gives the build a very unique identity. You're not just good at cleaving into grouped enemies, you are also fully capable of locking onto one player and deleting them when the opportunity appears. One of the most satisfying parts of this build is simply how often you get to enjoy Metamorphosis, which is still one of the most impactful transformation states in the game and gives the entire spec that overwhelming demonic power fantasy. And that's all folks.